Before Texas was Texas, before borders were drawn in ink and blood, there were the Tejano, a people of the borderlands who lived between empires, languages, and worlds. This is the story of how two books, Tejano and Texas Under the Mexican Flag, by Andres Tijerina, and Tejano Legacy, Rancheros and Settlers in South Texas, by Armando Alonso, unveil one of North America's most overlooked identities. A people who called the Rio Grande not a border, but a river that bound together two halves of their soul. Today, we're diving into the making of Tejano identity, how land, law, and loyalty shaped a culture that survived colonization, revolution, and assimilation, yet never disappeared. This is Tejano identity, roots, ranches, revolution. Let's begin in the 1730s, a century before Texas became a republic, when Spain's northern frontier was vast, underpopulated, and fragile. Spanish settlers, mestizos, and indigenous allies began moving north from what's now Mexico into the dry brushlands of South Texas. They were not conquerors in armor. They were ranchers, vaqueros, priests, and families. They built ranchos, sprawling estates powered by cattle, horses, and kinship networks. And from these estates, a new social identity began to form. Not purely Spanish, not indigenous, not entirely Mexican either. It was Tejano. Armando Alonso's Tejano legacy is not just about cattle and land. It's about continuity. It tells us that the Tejano world wasn't erased by American expansion. It evolved. Families like the De Leons, Navarros, and Benavides maintained political power, language, and faith through decades of regime change. From Spain to Mexico to the United States, they embodied resilience. They lived by a code older than any constitution. La familia, la tierra, y la fe, family, land, and faith. And those three pillars would become the heart of the Tejano experience. The ranchero system gave Tejano independence. Their culture centered around the land grant, inherited from Spanish law, which linked family honor to land stewardship. That legacy of property, respect, and identity outlasted empires. As Alonso writes, even when borders shifted, the Tejano spirit stayed tied to the soil. By the early 1800s, Tejano were among the most established frontier people in North America. Proud of their cattle culture, deeply Catholic, and aware of their unique status as borderland citizens of the Spanish crown. But by 1821, a new flag would wave above them, and everything, loyalty, language, and land, would be tested. When Mexico declared independence from Spain in 1821, Tejano became Mexican citizens overnight. Their world, once defined by distance from the capital, was suddenly pulled into the orbit of a new republic. Andres Tijerina's Tejano and Texas Under the Mexican Flag explores this turbulent moment, when the frontier became the fault line between Mexico and Anglo-American expansion. Under Mexican rule, Texas was both a promise and a problem. To the new government, it was a vast, sparsely populated region in need of settlers. So Mexico opened the gates, inviting Anglo-American colonists to live on Tejano land. Stephen F. Austin's colonists arrived, bringing a new culture, new language, and a new kind of ambition. But as Tijerina insists, Tejano were not passive. They were intermediaries, translators, merchants, diplomats. They forged the very channels of communication that allowed Texas to grow. Tejano served as mayors, judges, and militia captains. Their laws, like the alcalde system, and their ranching traditions influenced every corner of Texas life. Even the cowboy, that American icon, owes much to Tejano vaqueros. But beneath the cooperation, tensions brewed. Tejano began to see that their Mexican loyalties placed them between two rising forces: the new Anglo settlers and the distant Mexican government. By 1836, when revolution came, many Tejano were torn between old alliances and new realities. Some fought for Texas independence, others for Mexico's sovereignty, but nearly all found themselves caught in a struggle they didn't create. It's easy to romanticize the Alamo or San Jacinto, but Tejarina reminds us, Tejano didn't just lose a war. Many lost their place in history's story. Their role as bridge builders became invisible, overshadowed by the myth of the Anglo pioneer. Every culture carries its story in the land, and for the Tejano, the descendants of Spanish settlers, indigenous peoples, and frontier families, land was identity. But after 1836, land became loss. When Texas declared independence, many Tejano who had fought for the Republic found themselves dispossessed. Their land grants, secured under Spanish and Mexican law, were suddenly challenged by Anglo lawyers with English deeds and new systems of ownership. Armando Alonso's Tejano legacy explores this heartbreak. He documents how families like the Garzas, the Tejanos, and the de los Garzas spent generations fighting in court just to keep what was already theirs. Some won, most did not. Their cattle herds dwindled. Their ranches were divided. But they did not vanish. They adapted. Tejano became merchants, mule traders, blacksmiths, integrating into the border economy even as laws and borders shifted. Many became bilingual intermediaries, guiding the flow of goods, cattle, and people between Mexico and the United States. Tejarina reminds us that the so-called Mexicanization of Texas was not one way. In truth, Texas became Tejanoized. He writes that many Anglo settlers, those who came in wagons and wore buckskins, adopted Tejano lifeways. They learned to rope cattle the Tejano way. They built adobe ranch houses, ate tortillas and carne seca, and wore sombreros to beat the sun. This cultural interchange, this fusion, is where Tejano identity found its endurance. It was never purely ethnic. It was ecological, practical, and spiritual, shaped by how people survived in a landscape that respected no empire's flag. Tejano lived in what historians call the middle ground, a space between cultures, where adaptation was power. In many ways, Tejano history teaches us that survival is not submission, it's strategy. When laws change, you learn new laws. When tongues change, you speak both. When borders change, you build bridges across them. By the late 19th century, Tejano were no longer the majority in South Texas, but they were its memory. Their ranch names still mark the map. Their language still named the rivers, the hills, the plants, the stars. This was the Tejano legacy, a culture carried not by power, but by persistence. So, what is Tejano identity? It's easy to define it politically. Texans of Mexican descent, living in what became US territory. But culturally, it's something far deeper. It's the knowledge of two worlds, Spanish and Indigenous, Mexican and American, and the ability to move between them without losing yourself. Andrés Tejarina's research paints Tejano as cultural translators. Not just linguistically, but socially. They mediated law, trade, and governance between two nations that often misunderstood each other. He writes, Tejano were not remnants of a bygone empire, but the architects of a new frontier society. They introduced Anglo settlers to ranching techniques, cattle drives, branding systems, irrigation. They contributed to the creation of the Texas cowboy. And yet, their stories were buried under myth. The Alamo was remembered, but the names of Tejano heroes like José Antonio Navarro, Juan Seguin, and Erasmo Seguin faded from popular memory. Tejano culture was not destroyed, it was absorbed, often without credit. The Spanish word vaquero became buckaroo. The Tejano ranch became the American ranch. And the border became a line dividing what once was one world. But that's the paradox. Tejano identity survives not because it resisted all change, but because it contained it. It adapted. It remembered. It continued. Armando Alonso's Tejano legacy extends that continuity into the late 1800s. He shows us how families rebuilt their networks, sent children to bilingual schools, became local officials, and preserved oral traditions even under American rule. Tejano identity became the quiet heartbeat of South Texas, the sound of a culture that never needed permission to exist.